In this lesson, we're going to look at some of the drawing tools that are available to us. We certainly won't get to all of them. In fact, we probably couldn't get to all of them if we gave an entire course on it. But we'll take a look at some of them, and it'll give you an idea where to look for more. We're running the same kind of activity as we did in our first lesson about the canvas, and if you haven't seen that lesson, you ought to take a look at that first. We're creating a view called a tool view, and that's what we're going to set our content view to. And in the tool view, our goal is to draw 3 rectangles showing some different features that are available to us. So in our onDraw, we're calculating a rectangle height by just subtracting the top from the bottom and dividing it by 3. If you haven't done any kind of drawing code, I might want to explain this. The Y value increases as you go down the screen. So the top of the screen is typically Y equals 0, and as you go down it increases until you end up with the canvas height. So this bottom value is actually greater than the top value. So that gives us our rectangle height that we're going to use for the 3 rectangles that we're going to draw. And we're going to draw it 3 different ways. We're going to draw a rectangle, which means we're going to create a line outline. We're going to fill a rectangle, and that's just filling it with a solid color. And then we're going to do a gradient fill on the rectangle, which fades the color from one to another. I'm using a graphics helper class, and this is a class that I would typically create when I was creating a fair amount of drawing code, and in general I keep it as a library with a lot of drawing code that's handy for any kind of drawing applications or controls that I may create. So this is a bit of a starter for that kind of graphics helper class. And I create static methods for that helper. And the first one's going to be a draw rectangle. And we're going to pass in the canvas, the rectangle, the color we want, and the line width we want. We're going to use that paint object. And these ought to look familiar. We're going to set the style to a stroke. We're going to set the stroke width equal to the parameter line width. And we're going to set the color. So this is the same kind of thing we did when we were drawing regular lines. Then on the canvas, we use the drawRect method. The canvas has a number of different draw methods. So there are a lot of different objects that we can draw. And we'll take a look at some of them in the next lesson. In that draw rectangle method, we pass in the rectangle and the paint object. For the fill rectangle, we again pass in a canvas, a rectangle, and the color with which we want to fill it. And in this case, we set our style to fill as opposed to a stroke. We again give our paint the color, and we still draw a rectangle. If you were familiar with Windows drawing code, you might have expected a fill rectangle method here. But the fill is really controlled by the paint style as opposed to a method call. The next method we have is the gradient fill. Again, we pass in a canvas, a rectangle, the first color, and then the second color, which I'm calling gradient. So we're going to run a gradient, which is essentially a fade from this first color to the gradient color. And then we pass in a Boolean as to whether we want that gradient to be horizontal or vertical. In fact, we can actually make the gradient go in both directions, but to make this class a little bit simpler, I just put in a Boolean. The gradient is going to be looking for some coordinates. So I've created some variables for those. If the gradient is horizontal, then our x1 is going to be all the way over to the rectangle's right, and the y1 will be 0, which is the same value as y0. So essentially what this is saying is don't make the gradient go vertically at all, just run it from x0 to x1. Likewise, if it was a vertical gradient, we'd set the x coordinate to 0 and the y1 coordinate to the bottom of the rectangle. So then we create a shader object. And the shader can be any sort of effect, and there are a lot of them. So you might want to take a look at the Android documentation to see all the different possibilities. But if you can think about the effects that are in Photoshop, the vast majority are also in the Android operating system in the graphics namespace. In this case, we're going to create a linear gradient. We pass in our gradient coordinates, our colors, and a tile mode for the gradient. On our paint object, we set that shader equal to the new shader object, and then we do a draw rect, and again, still the same draw rect method. Going back up to our onDraw code of the original view, we create our first rectangle using the left and the top and the right, and then the bottom of the rectangle is going to be equal to the top plus the rectangle, and then we're just calling draw rectangle. Then to draw the second rectangle, all we want to do is move it down one rectangle's height. So we do an offset to the rectangle, not moving the x-coordinate at all, but moving the y-coordinate down one height, and then we do a fill rectangle using the color light gray. We offset it again, another rectangle height, and we do a gradient fill, and this time we're going to shake it up a little bit and go from hot pink to white. So let's see what that looks like. And here's our drawn rectangle, our solid color fill, which you may see a little bit of a optical illusion there, and then our gradient fill going from hot pink to white. So that's a quick look at some of the options that you can use. In our next lesson, we're going to take a look at drawing some other shapes.